The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. For decades, Europe has sold the image of a prison system built on rehabilitation, order, and human rights. But behind those iron gates, another reality exists, one defined by overcrowded cells, exhausted guards, and violence simmering just beneath the surface. In April 1990, that hidden tension exploded inside a Victorian-era prison in Manchester, England. Prison Strangeways descended into chaos as inmates seized rooftops, fires raged through cell blocks, and the state lost control for nearly a month. What happened there shocked Europe and exposed cracks that still haven't been fully repaired. This is not just the story of one riot. It is the story of how some of Europe's most notorious prisons became pressure cookers, and why chaos behind closed gates remains a warning the world cannot ignore. Strangeways. The day control was lost. Prison Strangeways was never designed to survive the modern prison population. Built in 1868, its radial layout reflected Victorian ideas of isolation and discipline, not mass incarceration. By the late 1980s, the prison was holding far more inmates than it was meant to contain. Cells designed for one man often held 2 or 3. Sanitation was poor. Inmates spent long hours locked behind doors with limited access to showers, exercise, or medical care. Guards, stretched thin by staff shortages, relied increasingly on routine and compliance rather than authority. Tension had been building for years. Inmates complained about overcrowding, slow grievance processes, and what they described as humiliating daily conditions. Guards, on the other hand, faced rising aggression, contraband smuggling, and an atmosphere of constant confrontation. The prison functioned not because it was stable, but because it had not yet reached its breaking point. That changed on April 1, 1990. The riot began during a routine chapel service. What initially appeared to be a protest quickly escalated when inmates overpowered staff. Within minutes, alarms were sounding throughout the prison. Guards were forced to retreat as prisoners seized keys, barricaded doors, and took control of entire wings. Fires were lit using bedding and furniture. Thick smoke filled the corridors, making large sections of the prison inaccessible. Within hours, Strangeways was no longer under state control. Inmates climbed onto the rooftops, openly defying authorities. From above, they could see police cordons forming outside the prison walls. Helicopters circled overhead. For the first time, the public was watching a prison riot unfold in real time. Media cameras captured prisoners shouting demands, waving banners, and throwing debris from the roof. The image shattered the perception of absolute institutional authority. Inside the prison, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Rival groups formed temporary alliances. Makeshift leadership structures emerged among inmates, some attempting to negotiate, others focused on destruction. Cells were smashed open. Administrative offices were ransacked. Records burned. The prison's physical structure, already aging, suffered catastrophic damage. Negotiators attempted to regain control through dialogue rather than force. Authorities feared that a full tactical assault could lead to mass casualties. Instead, the standoff dragged on for days, then weeks. As time passed, discipline among inmates fractured. Violence broke out between prisoners. One inmate died after being struck by falling debris. Hundreds were injured, inmates and staff alike. By the time the riot ended 25 days later, Strangeways was unrecognizable. Entire wings were destroyed. Infrastructure damage ran into the tens of millions. More damaging, however, was the exposure of systemic failure. An official inquiry later concluded that overcrowding, understaffing, and outdated facilities had created conditions ripe for disaster. The riot was not a spontaneous act of chaos. It was a result of long-ignored warnings. Strangeways became a symbol across Europe. It proved that even in countries with strong legal frameworks, prisons could collapse when pressure exceeded capacity. The riot forced reforms in the UK prison system, including reduced overcrowding and improved inmate conditions. But it also raised an uncomfortable question. If this could happen in Manchester, where else could it happen? The answer, as Europe would soon learn, was almost everywhere. Fleurimoroges. When mega-prisons become cities of tension. If Strangeways exposed how an old prison could collapse under pressure, Fleurimoroges revealed a different danger. What happens when a prison becomes too large to control? Located just south of Paris, Fleurimoroges is the largest prison complex in Europe. At its peak, it housed more than 4,000 inmates, spread across multiple buildings, security levels, and internal regimes. On paper, it represented modernization. In reality, it became a breeding ground for instability. Built in the 1960s, Fleurimoroges was designed to centralize incarceration on a massive scale. Instead of smaller, manageable facilities, France concentrated thousands of detainees, many awaiting trial, into one complex. Over time, overcrowding became chronic. Cells intended for one person routinely held 2 or 3. Temporary mattresses were placed on floors. Access to work, education, and medical care became limited by sheer numbers. Unlike Strangeways, Fleurimoroges did not experience one single riot that shocked the nation. Its crisis unfolded differently, through recurring violence, silent takeovers of prison space, and a slow erosion of authority. By the 2000s, reports from prison watchdogs and human rights organizations painted a disturbing picture. Assaults on guards were increasing. Inmate-on-inmate violence was frequent and often unreported. Entire cell blocks operated under informal rules enforced by dominant groups. Guards, outnumbered and under-resourced, focused on containment rather than control. Gang influence played a critical role. Many inmates arrived already affiliated with street gangs or criminal networks operating across France and neighboring countries. Inside Fleurimoroges, these affiliations didn't disappear. They evolved. Gang hierarchies adapted to prison life, controlling contraband flows, intimidating weaker inmates, and exerting pressure on staff. Drugs, phones, and weapons entered the prison through corruption, drone drops, and compromised logistics. For guards, the scale of the prison became a tactical disadvantage. In smaller facilities, disturbances could be isolated. At Fleurimoroges, unrest spread quickly. A fight in one wing could trigger lockdowns across the complex. False fire alarms, coordinated refusals to return to cells, and simultaneous protests overwhelmed response teams. Several incidents underscored how fragile control had become. In multiple documented cases, guards were assaulted during routine movements, meal distribution, cell searches, medical escorts. Some attacks were spontaneous. Others appeared coordinated, testing response times and security protocols. After particularly violent episodes, sections of the prison were placed under extended lockdowns, confining inmates to cells for up to 23 hours a day. These lockdowns only intensified resentment. Pretrial detainees, legally presumed innocent, made up a significant portion of the population. Many waited months, sometimes years, for their cases to be heard. Confined in overcrowded conditions with limited information about their future, frustration became explosive. Mental health crises surged. Suicide attempts increased. Self-harm became common. Staff shortages compounded every problem. As working conditions worsened, recruitment declined. Experienced guards transferred out or left the service entirely. New recruits, often young and undertrained, were thrown into one of Europe's most volatile environments. The imbalance of power was not always physical, it was psychological. Guards learned which inmates to avoid provoking, which corridors to move through quickly, and when to look away to maintain fragile peace. In effect, parts of the prison were governed through unspoken agreements rather than formal authority. The French government launched multiple reform efforts, promising new facilities, improved staffing, and alternatives to incarceration. But Fleurimoroges remained overcrowded. Each reform arrived slower than the population grew. Each new security measure was met with new methods of resistance. The prison became a warning sign not just for France, but for Europe. Mega prisons, once seen as efficient solutions, revealed their hidden cost. When too many people are confined in one place under constant stress, the system shifts from management to survival. Control becomes reactive. Violence becomes normalized. Accountability fades behind layers of bureaucracy. For audiences outside Europe, Fleury-Mérogis challenges assumptions. It shows that advanced legal systems and modern infrastructure do not guarantee stability. When incarceration scales up without proportional investment in staff, space, and rehabilitation, chaos does not arrive suddenly. It seeps in quietly. And while Fleury-Mérogis avoided a Strangeways-style explosion, its ongoing crisis raises a deeper concern. Prisons do not need to burn to fail. Sometimes, they simply stop working. Sudden flashpoints, riots, suicides, and systemic strain in Italy, Belgium, and Spain. While France struggled with the slow-burning instability of mega-prisons, Southern and Western Europe faced a more volatile pattern. Sudden eruptions of violence triggered by overcrowding, desperation, and institutional fatigue. In Italy, Belgium, and Spain, prison crises often arrived without warning, erupting in riots, mass protests, and waves of suicide that expose how fragile control had become across national borders. Italy's prison system has long operated beyond its intended capacity. Facilities designed for roughly 45,000 inmates regularly held well over 60,000. Cells meant for one person housed 3. Mattresses were laid across floors, sometimes within arm's reach of open toilets. Access to healthcare was inconsistent, and mental health support was severely limited. For inmates already facing long sentences or extended pretrial detention, the psychological toll was immense. This pressure exploded repeatedly. Italian prisons experienced frequent disturbances, fires set in cells, coordinated refusals to return after yard time, and violent confrontations with guards. In some cases, entire wings were rendered uninhabitable. Protests often followed a familiar pattern. A lockdown, a denied request, or a suicide would trigger unrest that spread faster than authorities could contain it. Suicides became a grim indicator of collapse. Human rights organizations documented rising self-inflicted deaths inside Italian prisons, often linked to overcrowding and lack of psychiatric care. Each death intensified anger among inmates, who viewed the system as indifferent to human life. Guards, already stretched thin, were forced to manage grieving, furious populations while maintaining security, a task that frequently proved impossible. Belgium faced a different but equally damaging crisis. Rather than explosive overcrowding alone, Belgian prisons suffered from chronic understaffing and repeated guard strikes. Facilities like Brussels' Forest Prison became symbols of neglect. During strikes, guards abandoned posts, leaving military personnel or minimal staff to oversee inmates. Basic services collapsed. Garbage piled up. Meals were delayed or canceled. Cells became unsanitary, and violence surged in the absence of routine supervision. In some instances, prisoners effectively governed themselves. Without regular patrols, dominant inmates imposed informal control over cell blocks. Weaker prisoners paid for protection or withdrew into isolation. Contraband flowed freely. The absence of authority did not lead to freedom, it led to fear. When guards returned, they faced populations that no longer respected institutional power. Spain's crisis unfolded under the shadow of reform. Spanish prisons invested heavily in modern facilities and surveillance technology. But overcrowding and long sentences, particularly for drug-related offenses, continued to strain the system. Riots and protests broke out over healthcare access, parole delays, and isolation practices. In some cases, inmates coordinated disturbances across multiple prisons, demonstrating how communication networks had evolved behind bars. Technology did not eliminate chaos, it reshaped it. Contraband phones allowed inmates to organize, intimidate witnesses, and coordinate resistance. Social media coverage of prison unrest spread rapidly, forcing authorities to respond under public scrutiny. Each incident raised questions about transparency, accountability, and the balance between security and human rights. Across all three countries, a shared pattern emerged. Overcrowding increased tension. Staff shortages reduced control. Mental health crises intensified violence. Each factor fed the next. Prison systems became reactive, responding to emergencies rather than preventing them. And while governments issued statements and promised reforms, the underlying conditions persisted. For inmates, daily life became unpredictable. A routine morning could turn into a lockdown lasting days. A fight in one wing could mean lost privileges for an entire facility. Trust eroded between inmates and guards, between staff and administrators, and between governments and the public. For guards, the job grew increasingly dangerous. Assaults were no longer rare incidents. They became expected risks. Burnout soared. Morale collapsed. Many officers described feeling abandoned by leadership, sent into volatile environments without adequate support or protection. These southern flashpoints reveal the hard truth. Europe's prison crisis was not confined to one nation, one facility, or one era. It was systemic. Different countries displayed different symptoms, but the disease was the same. Too many people, too few resources, and institutions pushed beyond their limits. And as unrest spread, one question became impossible to ignore. If prisons are meant to contain violence, what happens when violence becomes the organizing force inside them? Shadow governments, gang power, contraband, and control from the inside. When prisons lose consistent authority, power does not disappear, it shifts. Across Europe's most troubled facilities, gangs and criminal networks have filled the vacuum left by understaffed, overwhelmed institutions. What emerges is not chaos alone, but an alternative order, enforced through fear, loyalty, and profit. Inside overcrowded prisons, gangs provide structure. For some inmates, affiliation offers protection in an environment where vulnerability can be deadly. For others, it offers opportunity, access to contraband, influence over daily routines, and leverage against both inmates and staff. These groups often mirror street organizations, maintaining hierarchies, codes of conduct, and punishment systems adapted to prison life. Contraband is the lifeblood of this underground economy. Drugs, mobile phones, weapons, and luxury items move through prisons despite layers of security. In some European facilities, drones deliver packages over walls. In others, corrupt staff, visitors, or contractors smuggle items inside. Once inside, gangs control distribution. Prices are inflated. Debts are enforced violently. Failure to pay can mean assault, isolation, or forced participation in criminal activity. Mobile phones transform control. With access to phones, inmates communicate beyond prison walls, coordinating drug trafficking, intimidating witnesses, and maintaining influence over street operations. Inside, phones allow gangs to organize cell block resistance, spread misinformation during lockdowns, and monitor guard movements. Authority becomes porous. The prison walls no longer contain criminal power. They concentrate it. Guards face an impossible balance. Direct confrontation risks riots. Ignoring violations allows gangs to expand influence. Some officers develop informal arrangements to maintain peace, turning a blind eye to minor infractions in exchange for stability. While these compromises may reduce immediate violence, they erode institutional authority and create dependency on gang cooperation. In several European investigations, this pattern repeated. Facilities in Spain, France, and Italy documented areas where staff avoided entering without backup. Certain inmates became untouchable due to their influence. Transfers intended to break gang control often spread it instead, exporting leaders to new prisons where they rebuild networks. Isolation units, intended as a solution, sometimes worsen the problem. Extended solitary confinement fuels resentment and mental health deterioration. Released back into general population, isolated inmates often return more volatile and more loyal to gang protection. The cycle continues. For vulnerable inmates, the consequences are severe. Those who refuse affiliation are targeted. Extortion becomes routine. Sexual violence, though underreported, persists as a tool of control. Victims rarely come forward, fearing retaliation and doubting institutional protection. Staff corruption, though involving a minority, amplifies the crisis. Low pay, high stress, and constant exposure to violence create conditions where bribery becomes tempting. A single compromised officer can introduce phones, drugs, or weapons that destabilize an entire wing. Once exposed, the integrity of the institution is questioned by inmates and the public alike. European prison authorities respond with surveillance, intelligence units, and stricter controls. But technology cannot fully replace human presence. Cameras observe, but they do not intervene. Algorithms detect patterns, but they cannot de-escalate tension. What emerges is a grim paradox. Prisons become safer on paper, more cameras, more locks, more procedures, while becoming more dangerous in practice. Control exists, but it is fragmented. Authority is shared unwillingly with criminal organizations that thrive in neglect. For audiences watching from outside, this hidden governance challenges assumptions. Prisons are often imagined as places of absolute state power. In reality, when systems are overstretched, power becomes negotiated. Gangs do not overthrow prisons in dramatic coups. They inherit them quietly. And as long as overcrowding, understaffing, and neglect persist, these shadow governments will continue to operate, unseen, unaccountable, and deeply entrenched. Breaking point or reform. Europe's prison crisis and the global warning. By the time Europe openly acknowledged its prison crisis, the warning signs had been visible for decades. Riots like Strangeways, chronic instability in megaprisons like Fleury-Mérogis, recurring violence in Italy and Spain, and gang dominance across multiple systems were not isolated failures. They were symptoms of a model under extreme strain. European governments responded with promises of reform. New prisons were announced. Budgets were increased. Policies shifted toward rehabilitation, alternatives to incarceration, and early release for non-violent offenders. On paper, progress appeared real. In practice, change moved slowly, often slower than the growing prison populations. Overcrowding remained the central issue. Despite reforms, many European prisons continued operating above capacity. Courts relied heavily on pretrial detention. Immigration-related detention expanded. Drug-related sentences remained lengthy. Each new inmate added pressure to systems already stretched thin. Modern facilities did not guarantee stability. Newer prisons featured advanced surveillance, electronic doors, and reinforced architecture. Yet violence persisted. Technology improved containment but did not resolve human tension. Guards still faced understaffing. Inmates still navigated uncertainty, fear, and power struggles. The setting changed, but the dynamics remained. Mental health emerged as the crisis within the crisis. Across Europe, a significant percentage of inmates suffered from untreated psychiatric conditions. Prisons became default mental health institutions without the resources to fulfill that role. Isolation units filled with individuals who needed care, not confinement. Self-harm, suicide attempts, and psychotic episodes placed additional strain on staff ill-equipped to respond. Public scrutiny increased. Media coverage, watchdog reports, and court rulings forced governments to confront conditions behind bars. European human rights courts issued judgments condemning overcrowding and inhumane treatment. Some countries faced fines and legal mandates to reduce prison populations. Yet political pressure worked against reform. Public fear of crime made decarceration controversial. Politicians balanced human rights obligations against tough-on-crime rhetoric. In this tension, prisons became political battlegrounds rather than institutions of justice. The result was inconsistency. One facility improved while another deteriorated. One reform succeeded while another failed. Progress existed, but it was uneven and fragile. What Europe's experience ultimately revealed was not weakness, but universality. These problems are not uniquely European. They mirror crises in the United States, Canada, Latin America, and beyond. Overcrowding, gang influence, staff burnout, and mental health neglect follow incarceration wherever it expands faster than reform. Europe's prisons offer a warning, not a verdict. They show what happens when systems prioritize containment over care, efficiency over humanity, and reaction over prevention. They also show that collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, through normalized violence, silent suffering, and institutions that function without justice. The question facing Europe now is urgent. Can prisons be transformed into environments that reduce harm rather than multiply it? Can staff be protected without surrendering authority to gangs? Can rehabilitation exist inside walls designed for punishment? The answers remain uncertain. What is clear is this: prisons do not exist in isolation. They reflect the values, priorities, and failures of the societies that build them. When chaos thrives behind closed gates, it is not contained, it echoes outward. And as long as these lessons are ignored, history will repeat itself, not as a riot on a rooftop, but as a system slowly losing control. Behind every prison wall is a story most of us will never see. Stories of power, neglect, survival, and silence. Europe's most notorious prisons remind us that incarceration is not just about locking doors. It's about what happens when those doors stay closed for too long. If this documentary opened your eyes, stay with us. Subscribe for more real stories from behind the walls, because the truth doesn't end at the gate.